Hello everyone, it's Rob B here with Rob D, and this is the Property Podcast. It's episode 262. This week on the Property Podcast, we get our data sheets out. We decide once and for all, does the 10-year property cycle really exist, or is it a load of bull? We look at the differences between London and the Northwest, and some shocking data and some shocking investments made as well by one of us. And at some point, we get so excited, it all becomes a bit Batman.
Yes, welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning property hubbers come together to learn and get inspired. This week, such an important episode, one in fact you might wish you'd been able to listen to 10 years ago. So that coming up, and if you stick around, we'll let you know about a little bonus episode we've got for you as well. Okay, Rob, so our news story this week is from The Telegraph, and it flags up the last of a dying breed, the only area of England and Wales where you can still get a house on average for less than 100,000.
There's one left, and this place is going fast. Well, I'm not sure about that bit, but there is only one area left in the whole of England and Wales that you can get an average property for below £100,000. 97,147 to be precise. Now, Rob, I'm not going to be brave enough to pronounce the name of this Welsh town, but for those who are interested, you can find the link in our show notes. But what's really interesting, Rob, is the map that accompanies this data, because you can see when each area of the country exceeded £100,000. Now, London, way back when, no surprise, was the first area to exceed £100,000 for an average property, with Kensington and Chelsea going through that barrier 20 years ago. Wow. Now, what's amazing now is the average property price in every single borough in London is through 300,000, every single borough. So it way ahead, way ahead. Now, that may not come as a surprise, but isn't it amazing that nearly every single area now, every single one in the UK is about to go through 100,000. So you could say its property price is rising, but actually it's a bit of that, but also inflation playing a part as well.
All right, so does property really double in value every 10 years? It's one of those truisms that you see bandied about. It's the kind of thing that your average man on the street would say as a reason for investing in property. It's like, oh yeah, getting property, it doubles every 10 years. It's one of those things that's accepted as true. But at the same time, a lot of people get quite angry when this gets trotted out because they go, well, I've had a property for 10 years and it hasn't doubled. Well, we last looked at this topic 4 years ago. And the benefit of having been doing this podcast for a long time now is it's been long enough that we can go back to some of those earlier episodes, see what we were saying, and see what's actually happened in the real world in the meantime. So the first time we talked about this topic on the podcast was all the way back in episode 58. And back then, the first thing that we did was actually test this claim. Does property really double on average every 10 years? Here's what Rob B found out.
I've gone in, I've dug into the detail, I've been buried in Excel spreadsheets, and I can tell you, drum roll please, the average is actually 9 years. According to the data, it's just over every 9 years. So now when you're talking to somebody and they say, oh, property doubles every so-and-so, you can say with authority, because you've got the data from the Nationwide Price Index, that it doubles just over every 9 years. Oh, Rob, we sounded so young back then.
We did. So young, so enthusiastic. The enthusiasm's still there. The youth, not so much. But anyway, luckily we can't have discovered that we were wrong about that because that was the data that was saying that. That wasn't a prediction. So, phew. That was the average, just over every 9 years. But averages, as we know, can obscure a lot of variation. You also dug into the data and pulled out the shortest amount of time that it took to double.
The shortest, it's 3 years. Exactly 3 years. From 1971 to 74, prices doubled.
Yes, 3 years. What an amazing time that was.
Bonkers, Rob. Absolutely bonkers. Even today, just even though I have to accept it's true, still baffles me that took place. Absolutely crazy. What a time that must have been like to experience and see your property prices going through the roof like that. What really amazes me is that people still don't talk about it today, but we will. And while we have, and we're still amazed by it, that's not the reason we're here today.
No, doubling in 3 years is just not something that's on anyone's mind at the moment. More relevant is probably the longest that it's ever taken to double and whether we're going to hit a new record. So let's go back in time one last time and remind ourselves of the longest that property's ever taken to double.
The longest, I was close, I was 6 months out, it's exactly 14 years. So I thought it was 13 and a half, but it's exactly 14 years. And that was 89 to 03.
Okay, so to recap, on average, property doubles every 9 years. The longest period we've ever seen in the past is 14 years, and the shortest, unbelievably, is 3 years. And that is all from the nationwide data. But since then, we've got 4 new years of data. We're 4 years on from that episode, and so we thought it was high time to see how things are going.
So where are we? Well, let's start with it. Let's get it out the way. The 14-year record, the longest it's ever taken property to double, although we're not at 14 years yet, is pretty much nailed on to be broken. So we're just over 10 years from the peak, which was the third quarter of 2007, where UK property prices, according to Nationwide, were £184,000. So, 10 years on, Rob, you ready for it? We're at £211,000. So 184 to 211. Not that spectacular, really.
No, so we're living in extraordinary times, but in the most boring of ways. It was extraordinary times in the 70s when it doubled in 3 years, but now it's remarkable because, well, it's taking a bit of time, really. It's a bit boring.
So, few numbers for you. Will it add another 157,000? Or put another way, grow roughly 75% in value over the next 4 years? Well, we've heard it's happened before, but yeah, we don't think it's going to happen in the next 4 years. We are certain, well, as certain as you can be, that the 14-year record will be broken. Maybe by a couple of years, maybe 16, we'll see. But we fully expect it to be broken.
Okay, so I said that we had some new data. We've got 4 new years of data. So how have things gone since we recorded that episode? So in order for property prices to double every 10 years, you need to have 7% growth per year, because compounded after 10 years, that gets you to 100% growth. Over the last 4 years, the growth was 8.3%, 4.3%, 4.5%, and 2.7%. So on average, that's just under 5%. So if you were inspired by our episode back then and you rushed out and you bought a property and by some remarkable coincidence you managed to buy the average UK property, then by now you'd have owned it for 4 years and you could expect to wait another 10 years at the current growth rate of 5%, which would make it a 14-year cycle.
Which may sound bad, Rob, but if you offered me 5% growth on every single property I own from here on forward, I'd sign the contract today. I'd be delighted with 5% growth. I know that's the longest, but 5%'s worth a bit of money. I'd take it. May not be that exciting, but it's still going to make you wealthy over the long term.
It would, but it would put you on the longest cycle that we've ever seen, and things are slowing down. So we've gone from 8% growth down through sort of the 4%, and last year was 2.7%. So even if we maintained that 5% average, it would be on track for the longest cycle ever. It actually seems to be slowing down more than that, so does that mean that the old rules have gone out the window?
Well, Rob, it sounds like we're about to break some terrible news to all our podcast listeners that property no longer doubles in those cycles and actually could be not the great investment we all think it is. But no, no, it's not the case. The old rules have not gone out the window. They are here today. Now, people will be listening to this and go, it's different this time. Or you'll speak to people and they'll say, no, it's different. But that's just recency bias. People always think it's different now. This is not new. This is a phenomenon that's occurred throughout history, not just in property cycles, in all things. It's different this time because there's some justification. But actually, bringing in the 18-year property cycle, which I think we've been very well restrained to yet to mention, Rob, we certainly could have expected this and predicted this. This should come as no surprise.
No surprise at all. And we dug into the data ourselves for an episode about this back in episode 224, an episode called Back to the Future, How to Predict Future Property Prices. In that episode, we went into the nationwide data and we pulled out some conclusions to map it onto the property cycle with some pretty remarkable findings. That episode is so relevant to what we're talking about today. It's such a perfect companion episode that we're actually going to drop it back into the Property Podcast feed tomorrow. So having listened to this episode, which is about the concepts, then tomorrow you can revisit that episode from about a year ago to show that we're not just making this stuff up. All the data is there. And one of the main things that came out of that episode, which always gets ignored when people talk about property doubling every 10 years and the cycle and all that sort of thing, is the regional variations. We went in and looked at it region by region. Some really interesting stuff came out of it. But Rob, the message doesn't really seem to have got through still.
No, it doesn't. So, for the handful of people, and it's a handful of people who've cornered me at a Property Hub meetup and took me to task for reporting the data on what's happened in the past and talking about how property on average doubles every 9 years, longest 14 and shortest 3 years. Remember, that's data. This is not my beliefs. So when you tell me that your property hasn't doubled and kind of look at me like I should make up the difference, remember, this is data, but we put you right, we put you straight for these handful of people. we put you straight in this other episode, so make sure you listen to it tomorrow, because it's critical that you do if you want to make money from property in the future. And as we said, the regional differences are so important that, Rob, I think we should look at them now, because we can see how the different regions have performed with this extra 4 years data we've got now.
Okay, so let's start with London. So London, no surprise, has been the strongest performer since the crash in 2008, which we're now 10 years on from. In the third quarter of 2007, which is roundabout peak, the average London price was £302,000. Today, it's £470,000. It has actually been higher than that, but it's been falling for the last year or so. So now it's back down to 470,000. So is London going to sneak inside the 14 years and avoid being the longest doubling cycle ever? Well, to do that, it would need to grow 28% over the next 4 years. That would mean that it would doubled inside the 14. Is that going to happen? Well, it's certainly possible.
It is. But what's really interesting is when you start to take out different years. So we've gone back to the last peak. But if you go back 5 years ago, property in London was £300,000 on average. Remember, back in 2007, it was roughly the same. But 5 years ago, it had recovered to 300,000 in London. So it now stands at 470. So if property prices do grow over the next 4 years, and in total grow 28%, then actually if you bought 5 years ago, add 4, makes 9, it means that London, the people who bought 5 years ago in London, will see the UK average growth of 9 years. And this is why cycles are so important. And that's why this bonus episode that's coming out tomorrow is a key companion to this episode, because it's not about buying the average property in the average cycle. It's trying to be a bit smarter than that. But Rob, let's add some balance, because we've been big fans of the North West and Yorkshire. So now let's look at the North West data and see what that's telling us.
Okay, so 10 years ago in the North West, the average price of a property was £159,000. Today, it is £157,000.
Ouch.
So it's actually fallen slightly in 10 years. And if you take inflation into account in real terms, it will have fallen pretty heavily. And this is where you get people angrily coming up to you, Rob, and telling you that their property in the Northwest hasn't doubled in the last 10 years. In fact, it could take another 10 years to double. So you could be looking at a 20-year cycle. So does that mean that we're wrong to be banging the drum for the Northwest? Does that mean that property doesn't really double every 10 years? Does that mean that, Rob, you should be putting your hand in your pocket and making up the difference? Well, no, because timing is important, like we've just been saying.
It's a bit like a Batman episode then, Rob. You know, like, will Batman be saved by... Will the northern property prices recover? Sorry. But let's have a look. So the last 2 years then, let's look at the cycles, because we've been really big on the Northwest in the last 2 years, and the cities in particular. We're not currently looking at the data for the cities, more on that to come, but let's look at the Northwest. Last 2 years, it's grown 6% a year, which would mean property prices would double 12 years at that rate. So, if you started investing in the Northwest and bought an average property in the Northwest, whatever that is, then you will have seen your property grow roughly 6% a year, and that means you're on track at that run rate for property to double within 12 years, so beating the worst case. Now, as we said, some areas in the Northwest are going to perform far better than others. And Rob, of the Northwest, a city that we've been particularly keen on in the last couple of years is Manchester. So why don't we dig into that data? Now, the Nationwide Price Index doesn't give us data for Manchester, so we've had to use Home Track. But I think it's important that we have a look.
Okay, so looking at the Home Track data, over the last 2 years, Manchester has grown at 7.5% per year, among the fastest in the UK. So, if that continues, then Manchester would be on track to double in just under 10 years. So the Northwest has had a pretty shocking 10 years. Prices have actually fallen. Manchester prices 10 years ago we don't have, but we could assume that it followed the pattern more or less of the wider region. But we're not buying 10 years ago, we're buying today. And if you're buying today, it seems to make sense to buy into somewhere that's growing. And despite the general weakness of the economy and the general flatness of UK property prices, prices up in Manchester are doing really well. So why is that? Well, it's all about the cycles. And again, the bonus episode tomorrow is going to be a critical component to this, because in that episode we show that different regions move at different times. Just because the Northwest has performed poorly for the last 10 years, it doesn't follow that it's therefore going to perform poorly for the next 10 years. In fact, it's got some making up to do, and you could expect it to outperform the average this time round. So, Rob, the points that seem to get missed here is that cycles are so important, and there are really big, important regional differences that don't matter if you're a journalist reporting on what's happening in property in general, but do hugely matter if you're a property investor trying to maximise your returns.
This is why subjects like this are so important to understand. And that podcast tomorrow, again, a big part of that. Because if you have even just a basic understanding of the cycles and where property is going to move and move next, then you, as an investor, will make far better decisions. The prediction shows that Rob and I do each year. Last year, we got most of it right. It's not because we are some evil geniuses who've got a secret pathway into the future. It's because we just look at the cycles, and actually, once you get to understand them, get to grips with them, it's pretty much common sense. And those predictions you make may sound bold, but actually, it's just following what's happened before, because it's happened before not once, but multiple times. This isn't new. So where people think it's different this time, actually, my friend, it's not different this time. It's so close to what's happened before, it's almost dull. But so dull, you can take advantage of it. So, Rob, it leads back to our original question. Does property really double every 10 years?
Well, does it? Well, yeah, it can, and it does. But averages aren't all that helpful. And what gets missed is that it's all about buying in the right place at the right time. Not every time is an equally good time to be buying property. Not every place is an equally good place to be buying property. We've seen two really clear examples of this just in this episode. If you bought property 10 years ago in London or 5 years ago in London, you'd be in exactly the same position. Prices since then have gone absolutely bonkers, but that's the cycle. You can also look at the Northwest. If you'd bought 10 years ago, you'd be worse off today than you were back then. It's a disastrous performance. That's because 10 years ago, it was the UK-wide peak. So you'd be buying at the peak, you'd have seen your property fall in value, and in the Northwest, it would have stayed down until just the last couple of years when it started to come back again. So you cannot buy the average UK property. So that's why understanding the cycle is so important, and why, if you really want to maximise your returns, being open-minded enough to invest anywhere in the UK is also really important. Because at any given point in the cycle, your local area could be a great place to invest, or it could be a terrible place to invest. If all you want to do is collect the rent and you're not too bothered about what happens to the capital value, that's not a problem. But if you want to really do as well as you possibly can, then you need to be going where the data tells you is the place to go. But Rob, this is all well and good for us to be pointing out now. Someone might be saying, well, great, but I bought a property in the wrong place at the wrong time. I bought one of these properties in the Northwest 10 years ago. It's still worth less than I paid for it. What should you do in that situation?
You're an idiot. No, you're not, don't worry. Because I did that 11 years ago, 2006, bought a property in the Northwest, not in one of those wonderful cities we mentioned. So, what's happened? Well, guess what? My property is only now just about worth what it was 11 years ago. So the data is correct. Do I regret owning that? Well, would I go back and do it again? No. So I will say that. But am I angry or annoyed? Absolutely not. Because that property, even though the capital value hasn't gone up, it still paid me an income every single month, or pretty much nearly every single month, because it's rented really well, so the fundamentals were there. So nearly every month, I've received an income from that property. So it's not that bad. Even if you buy, and I'm here, holding my hand up, you can't see it, but I am, at the worst time in the cycle, in the worst areas for that time in the cycle. So the worst case actually isn't that bad, which is the good news. So if you've made a mistake, don't worry, you're probably still earning an income from it. But the great news now is you're armed with all this information that you can avoid making mistakes like that again and actually do far, far better than the average. Remember, the average still stands. It is that 9 and a bit years. But imagine now, because you're armed with that information, that you can beat that cycle. That 9 years is not the number that you want, it's a number to beat. Set that as your target. And the great news is, over the next few years, as you'll hear tomorrow, the best is yet to come.
Okay, so every week we take the time to acknowledge someone who has kindly left us a review. A 5-star review, we hope for. Rob, have we got one of those this week?
Oh, we have, Rob. In fact, I'm going to throw a couple in because you just can't stop and we love it. So a huge thanks to these hubbers. First up, we got Steve, and Steve says, the Property Podcast is brilliant information resource presented by two guys who clearly are passionate and enthusiastic about property investment. There's so much valuable content here, I would strongly suggest going back and listening through. And you may save some money on some very expensive industry courses on offer elsewhere. And time for a quick word from Giles, because Giles says, "Chaps, can't thank you enough. I've been listening for over a year now and I'm about to complete on my third property. I wouldn't have had the confidence to do this without the free education I've received from this invaluable resource." Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Giles. Awesome, and well done for taking action.
All right, so that is us done for today. Remember that bonus episode is coming up tomorrow, so check your feed and you'll have a nice little surprise in there. It's a perfect follow-on once you've absorbed this episode, so check that one out. And then we'll be back on Tuesday, as always, with Ask Rob and Rob. Until then, have a great time. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to The Property Podcast. For show notes, all our past episodes, and to leave a review, go to thepropertyhub.net/podcast.